Elias Harper had dug himself out of a lifetime of small disappointments and hard winters to build a ranch that hummed with the slow satisfaction of honest labor. He measured the days by sunlight across fence posts and the way the horse's breath condensed in the mornings. When the spring edition of the Eastland Matrimonial Gazette arrived, he found himself scanning neat columns of polite desperation like he scanned weather reports, checking possibilities, calculating risk. He wanted a partner who could warm a kitchen and keep accounts, a woman who would be grateful for the shelter and the steadiness. A simple life, he thought. A simple woman. He wrote a short advertisement, careful as a contract. Steady man, steady land, neutral temperament preferred. He didn't say anything about the loneliness that sometimes settled like dust in the corners of his kitchen or the way he sometimes spoke to the empty chair at the table. Letters came, some flowery, some apologetically brief. Then one arrived from a city called Willowmere. It was neither flowery nor brief. It was a thing of quiet intelligence, inked in a hand that sloped like a river. The writer, Marian Blythe, described herself as a woman who reads widely, cooks well enough, and prefers to keep her opinions to herself unless the company demands otherwise. She enclosed a photograph. A woman in a dark dress with her hair pinned back, eyes like broken-in steel, and a mouth that didn't promise softness so much as curiosity. When the train pulled into the nearest depot, Elias went with a cart of flowers someone had thought proper for a bride. He imagined a timid smile, a folded hand, a woman asking where to hang her bonnet. Instead, Marian stepped down onto the gravel with a suitcase in one hand and a crate in the other. A small hawk hopped on the crate and eyed the prairie with unimpressed regard. Elias blinked. The hawk blinked back. "Mr. Harper?" she asked, voice even, a flicker of amusement in the corners. The hat on his head felt suddenly absurd. "Yes," he said. "Elias Harper." "Marian Blythe." She offered her hand like a subject offering a fact. It was warm and firm. Dust specked her cuffs. Her dress, though plain, was tailored. A strip of lace at the collar hinted at an upbringing that had not been entirely practical. She set the crate in the cart and then, as though testing a rule, she looked him over. "This is your ranch?" "It is," he said. "Small." "Reliable." She nodded once. "Good. I prefer reliable." The ride home was quiet but not awkward. Marian asked direct questions about the springs, the market, the likelihood of drought. Elias answered in the language of fences and feed. When he tried to ask about her life in Willowmere, she smiled sideways and said, "Ask when the tea is hot." There was something at once civil and disarming in the way she set boundaries. That first evening, as twilight glued the hills to the horizon, Marian opened her crate. Inside were jars, preserves from unfamiliar fruits, neatly labeled in a hand that made Elias feel like he had stumbled into a library. She produced a small stack of books, Darwin, a slim volume of Alexander Pope, a local paper folded to show an essay on women's suffrage. Elias put down his mug. "You read," he said, as if discovering a hidden stream. "I read what I like," she said. "I write too." Her smile shifted. It was a thing that could be leveled like sunlight onto a map. "I answered your advertisement because I'm tired of waiting for a life I was told I'd get by the time I was 22. I wanted a partnership where I could cook, yes, but also think. I wanted land that might be honest with me." Elias's mouth opened and closed. The phrase partnership slid around his chest like a toad, suddenly loud, unexpectedly alive. He had not considered partnership. He had considered provision and acceptance, a simple exchange of shelter for domesticity. Marian's presence complicated equations he'd practiced for years. He felt, for the first time, like his neat ledger had been opened to a new page and someone had written in an ink he didn't yet understand. The town watched them with the appetite of people who enjoy the rearrangement of others' lives. At the church supper, an elder woman raised an eyebrow at Marian's hawk, and an even more pronounced one at the slim volume of Pope peeking from under her cloak. "She reads poetry," the woman whispered. delightedly scandalized to anyone who would listen. "And what's that? An interest in politics, perhaps?" Marian met the gaze and said, loud enough to carry, "I like verse, and I think governments should answer the questions people ask of them." There was no malice in her voice, no desire to shock, but there was a clarity that disarmed gossip like a door slammed in its face. The church returned to singing. The soup remained warm. Elias found himself speechless more than once. It was not always the sort of speechlessness that needed to be filled. Sometimes it was the quiet, stunned kind that arrives when you discover the horizon is wider than you thought. He watched Marian mend a torn saddle, sleeves rolled up, hands patient and precise. He watched her teach the hired man to keep better books, then catch herself and laugh and say, "We're all learning." He watched her walk to the ridge at dawn with the hawk on her fist and listen to the land as if it spoke in sentences he had never heard. There were moments of friction. Marian refused to be called "my wife," in the possessive way some people use the term. She insisted they make decisions together. She argued sometimes about how they should plant barley. Elias, stubborn and used to being the final voice, found those arguments like a wind that rearranged his usual patterns. He argued back, learned to listen, and found that when she won, which she sometimes did, the decisions were better for it. One afternoon, a banker from the county seat rode into town with a paper and a look that spelled trouble. A cattleman up north had fallen ill and defaulted. The bank wanted to foreclose on a neighboring ranch. The neighbors gathered and murmured about the loss of a man who couldn't keep up with finances. Elias's jaw tightened. If the bank took that land, their community would shrink a little more. Marian read the notice, then did something Elias did not expect. She got into the saddle. "We go," she said. They rode out not as a man and a timid bride, but as two people who had learned how to sit across from one another and count risks. At the bank, Marian spoke first, a series of questions about the timeline and a suggestion for restructuring payments that the banker seemed not to have considered. Her manner was crisp and convincing, her language precise. The banker, who had expected to deal with a rancher and perhaps a meek woman on the sidelines, found himself arguing with someone who knew the figures better than he did. Elias watched the man he had barely known a few months become the equal of the ledger and the law. When they came back to the ranch that evening, the neighbors who had watched stood a little straighter. The ranch to the north would not be lost. That night, Marian perched on the porch rail and looked at the stars. Elias sat beside her with boots off and a long silence between them that felt like conversation. "You left a life for this," he said softly. "Why choose this? Me? A simple ranch?" Marian's hand found the hawk's back, fingers light. "I didn't leave a life, Elias. I chose one." She turned to him then, the fatigue and the satisfaction in her face smoothing into something like amusement. "Simple isn't always what it is made out to be. A life that lets you stand in the morning, work with your hands and your head, feed people, think about books at night. That can be as complicated as the city." I answered because I wanted a place where I didn't have to shrink my opinions like something fragile. He swallowed. The word shrink struck something tender and old inside him. He had learned to make room for horses and barns. He had never quite learned to make room for someone whose mind would fill the kitchen as readily as her arms did the washing. The thought of her carved into his days was both terrifying and beautiful. "Do you regret it?" he asked after a moment. Marian's laugh was a small, honest thing. "Regret takes a long time to arrive. For now, I'm content. Besides," she added, looking at him with a spark that made his skin prickle, "you keep your ledger straight. That's rare." Elias smiled, finally able to speak without a hitch. "You leave me breathless sometimes, Marian Blythe." She turned to him fully then, the light catching the steel in her eyes. "Good," she said. "Sometimes I like to see what you do when you're speechless." He looked at her, the hawk, the jars, the books. and understood that the woman who had arrived was not any kind of failure to his expectations. She was the unexpected necessary thing, a companion who would make the ranch less simple and the life on it richer. He leaned forward and kissed her, clumsy and earnest. For once, he had no words left to fumble, and it was enough. Outside, the prairie breathed its old slow breath. Inside, the cottage hummed with the promise of arguments about planting and poetry and the right recipes for plum preserves. Elias had wanted a steady life. What he had been given was steadiness with sparks. Speechless was no longer the same as empty. It was listening. It was the starting point for the real work of sharing a table and a horizon.